did not make a scene. I did not raise my voice. I just stood there in my own kitchen. The kitchen I had paid for, the kitchen I had gutted and rebuilt from the studs out. And I read the message a second time to make sure I was understanding it correctly. I was. My son was telling me I wasn't welcome at my own granddaughter's graduation party. The party being held at the lake house. My lake house. I set my phone face down on the counter, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the table by the window. Outside, the maple tree I planted the year my wife passed was just starting to turn red at the tips. October always comes too fast. I thought about everything I had done for my son over the past 11 years, not because I was keeping score. I never kept score. That was never who I was. But because sometimes you need to remind yourself that you are not crazy, that what you are feeling is real, that the ground beneath you actually shifted, and you did not imagine it. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a construction company from a single truck and a handshake, and I have one son. His name is Mitchell. He is 34. He married a woman named Celeste 8 years ago, and they have a daughter together, my granddaughter Paige, who just turned 18. I loved that girl from the moment she was born. I was in the waiting room when she came into the world, pacing back and forth on that terrible linoleum floor, and when the nurse came out and said it's a girl, I sat down and cried like I hadn't cried since the funeral. Good tears. The kind that clean you out. Mitchell and I were close once. When he was young, before Celeste, before the money started coming in and started changing things in ways I didn't notice until it was too late. We used to fish together on Saturday mornings. He worked summers on my crew in high school, not because he had to, but because he wanted to learn. I was proud of that kid in a way that I don't have the right words for. Then he married Celeste. I want to be fair. I don't think she is a bad person exactly. I think she is a person who grew up with certain ideas about what a comfortable life looks like, and she found in Mitchell someone who could provide it. And she found in me a source of funding that she never quite distinguished from an inheritance she was simply receiving early. The first thing I did was help them with the down payment on their house, $85,000. Mitchell said it was a loan. I said, don't worry about it, you're my son. That was my mistake, and I owned it. I just didn't know yet what I was owning. The second thing was the lake house. I had owned that property for 20 years, bought it cheap, fixed it up myself over 3 summers, spent weeks out there with my tool belt and my radio and the kind of quiet that you can only find when you're working with your hands. I let Mitchell and Celeste use it whenever they wanted. Most weekends, honestly. It got to the point where I was calling ahead to make sure they weren't there before I drove up. The third thing was Paige's private school tuition, 4 years, $28,000 a year. Because Celeste had decided that the public school in their district wasn't good enough, and Mitchell had agreed with her. And then they had both looked at me across a restaurant table and explained that they just didn't have the financial flexibility right now. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was my granddaughter. What I am telling you is not a story about money. It is a story about what happens when you love people more than they value that love. When you confuse generosity with being valued. I learned that distinction slowly, the way you learn most painful things, not all at once but in small installments over years. The message came on a Thursday evening. I had been planning to drive up to the lake house that Saturday for Paige's graduation party. I had already bought a gift, a leather-bound journal and a savings bond, because that is the kind of grandfather I am, practical and a little old-fashioned. And I had confirmed with Mitchell 2 weeks earlier that I would be there. The message was from Celeste. Not even from my son. From my daughter-in-law. Hi! Just a heads up. The party Saturday is going to be a smaller thing than we originally planned. Really just immediate family and Paige's friends. We think it'll be better for Paige if it's a more intimate group. Hope you understand. I read it 3 times. I typed back, I'm her grandfather. She replied 12 minutes later, of course, and she loves you. But she specifically asked for a smaller group. We're trying to respect her wishes. Maybe you two can do something together another time. I called Mitchell. He picked up on the fourth ring and sounded like he'd been expecting the call the way you expect a dentist appointment, something unpleasant that had to be gotten through. "Dad, it's just how she wanted it," he said. "She wanted her grandfather excluded from her graduation party. She's 18. She gets to decide who she's comfortable with. Mitchell, I paid for 4 years of that school. I paid for the house you're throwing the party at." There was a pause, and then he said something that I have thought about almost every day since. "Dad, money doesn't entitle you to be somewhere you're not wanted." I didn't respond. I just said, "Okay, son," and I hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that. The maple tree outside was doing what it does. The coffee went cold. I thought about what he said, and I realized something. He was right. Money doesn't entitle you to be somewhere you're not wanted, but it does entitle you to stop spending it. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Jeffrey, and he has been handling my affairs for 16 years. I trust him completely. I told him what had happened, and I told him what I wanted to do. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciate about Jeffrey. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I can have the paperwork ready by end of day." The lake house was in my name, always had been. I had never transferred it, never changed the deed, never done anything to cloud my ownership because it had never occurred to me that I would need to. That oversight, which could have been a vulnerability, turned out to be a clean line in the sand. I called the property manager I use for occasional rentals and told him I wanted to list the lake house immediately. He said he had a couple who'd been inquiring about that exact area for months. I called my bank and put a stop on the automatic transfer I'd been making to Mitchell's account every month, $1,200, which I had been sending quietly for the past 3 years under the understanding that it helped with household expenses. I had never asked for an accounting of those expenses. I just sent the money. Every first of the month, like a utility bill. Then, I drove to the lake house. I had a key, obviously. It was my property. I let myself in and walked through the rooms slowly. Celeste had redecorated at some point without telling me. New throw pillows, a different rug in the living room, some kind of driftwood arrangement on the mantel that I didn't recognize. Small things, things that told me, quietly, that she had already made a decision about whose space this was. I walked out onto the dock. The water was still and cold-looking, that deep blue-green color it gets in October. A pair of geese were moving along the far shore. I stood there for about 10 minutes, just breathing, just being in a place I had loved for a long time. Then I went back inside and I took the spare key from the hook by the door, the one I had given Mitchell years ago, and I put it in my jacket pocket. I changed the lockbox code on the way out. The party was Saturday. I know what happened because Mitchell called me at 11:14 that morning and he was not calm. "Dad, the code on the lockbox doesn't work." "I know." "What do you mean you know? Paige has 30 people coming in 3 hours. "Mitchell, I changed the code. The property is going to be listed for sale next week. I thought it was appropriate to secure it beforehand." There was a long silence. I could hear Celeste's voice in the background, sharp and rising. "You're selling the lake house?" "Yes." "Because of the party?" "No," I said. "Because it's my property, and I've decided it's time. I'm 63. I don't want to maintain a second property at this stage of my life. It's a reasonable decision." "Dad." "Mitchell, you told me that money doesn't entitle a person to be somewhere they're not wanted. I've been thinking about that, and I think you're right. Money doesn't entitle me to anything. Which means I also have no obligation to keep spending it in ways that don't make sense to me anymore." He hung up. Celeste called 20 minutes later. Her voice had a texture I hadn't heard before. Something stripped down, something urgent in a way she usually kept hidden under the smooth surface of her manner. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. "I don't think there has been," I said, "but I'm happy to talk." She tried for about 20 minutes. She explained that the party invitation had been mishandled, that Paige had never actually said she didn't want me there, that it was a communication failure, that she herself had worded the message poorly. She was gracious about it in a technical sense. She used all the right conciliatory language. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Celeste, I appreciate you saying that. I'm going to take some time to think about things. The house is going to be listed. The monthly transfer has already been stopped. Those decisions are made. If Mitchell wants to talk, I'm available." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about Paige's party?" "I hope she has a wonderful afternoon," I said. And I meant it. Whatever was broken between the adults in this family, Paige was 18 years old and she deserved a good day. That had nothing to do with her. I want to tell you what the next few weeks were like, because this is where most people assume the story becomes about victory, some kind of clean settling of accounts. It wasn't. It was quiet mostly, and strange. Mitchell came to my house the following Tuesday. He stood in my driveway for a few minutes before he knocked, which I found out later because my neighbor mentioned seeing him. When I opened the door, he looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. He was still my son. He was still the kid who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from fishing, his head against the window, the rods rattling in the back. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee and he talked for a long time. Some of it was defensive. Some of it circled back around to Celeste and what she had or hadn't meant and what Paige had or hadn't said. I let him talk. I didn't argue with any of it. At one point he said, "I didn't think you'd actually do anything." I looked at him for a moment. "I know," I said. "That's the part I've been sitting with." He didn't have an answer for that. What I didn't tell him, what I couldn't quite explain even to myself, was that the lake house sale wasn't really about the party. Not entirely. It was about 11 years of slow drift. 11 years of being treated like infrastructure rather than family, a reliable structure that everyone uses without thinking much about what holds it up. The party just made it visible in a way I couldn't unsee. The house sold in 18 days. Good price, clean transaction. I took the proceeds and set up a separate account that I have since designated in my estate documents, in ways that reflect my current relationships rather than my previous assumptions. Jeffrey helped me with that. The monthly transfer stayed stopped. Paige called me in November, about 6 weeks after all of this. I'd been wondering if she would. Her voice was careful at first, the way young people sound when they've been coached on what to say, but after a few minutes it softened into something more real. She said she hadn't known about the message Celeste had sent. She said she found out after, and she didn't understand why that decision had been made. I believed her. I told her that whatever had happened between me and her parents, none of it was about her, that I loved her, that I wanted to know what she was planning to do after graduation, what she was thinking about, what her life was going to look like. She wanted to study landscape architecture. I hadn't known that. We talked for an hour and a half. At the end of the call, she said, "Grandpa, I'm sorry about your lake house." I said, "I'm not. I have good memories of that place, that's enough." Mitchell and I are in a different place now than we were a year ago. I won't pretend it's repaired, because it isn't. There are conversations we haven't had yet. There are things he did that I haven't fully made peace with, and I suspect there are things I did, years of enabling, years of making it too easy, that he hasn't made peace with either. What I know is this: I stopped pretending. I stopped writing checks to fill a space that should have been filled with something else. And whatever grief came with that, and there was grief, real grief, the kind you don't expect when you're doing something that feels right, it was mine to carry. I carried it. My son is not a villain. My daughter-in-law is not a villain. They are people who got comfortable with an arrangement that was never sustainable, and they never asked themselves what it was costing me because I never showed them. That is something I have to own. But ownership goes both ways. I am 63 years old. I still get up early. I still drink my coffee by the window and watch the maple tree and think about the people I have loved and what I wanted my life to mean. I don't have the lake house anymore, but I have the memories of building it. Of those 3 summers with my hands in my radio and the particular satisfaction of something solid that you made yourself. Some things once built don't go away just because you stop maintaining them. I learned that about houses. I'm still learning it about family. If you are somewhere in the middle of something like this, if you have spent years being generous and find yourself wondering whether any of it was seen, I am not going to tell you what to do. That is not my place. What I will tell you is that the moment I stopped making myself smaller to fit someone else's comfort, I could breathe again. That is not a small thing. That is, at 63, everything. I have thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any grand philosophical way. I'm a construction man, I think in practical terms. But in the simple, honest way that you think about things when you're sitting alone at a kitchen table and the coffee has gone cold and you're finally being straight with yourself. What I did for Mitchell over the years came from a real place. The down payment, the lake house, the tuition, the monthly transfer, none of it was calculated. I gave because I loved him, and because I had the means, and because somewhere inside me I believed that generosity was its own kind of language, that if I kept showing up with my checkbook and my tool belt and my willingness to carry whatever needed carrying, he would understand what I was saying without me having to say it. That was my failure. Not the giving, the silence around it. I never once sat down with my son and said, "This is what I need in return," not money, not gratitude in some formal sense, just to be seen, to be counted, to not be the last person on the list when it came to something that mattered. I let that silence go on for 11 years. And in that silence, Mitchell and Celeste built a version of our relationship that was comfortable for them. I was the foundation. Foundations don't get invited to the party. Foundations just hold things up. When the message came, the one that told me I wasn't welcome at my own granddaughter's graduation, the cause and effect became impossible to ignore. I had spent over a decade making myself easy to take for granted. And they had, without malice, taken me for granted. That is not a mystery. That is just what happens when you never draw a line. The decision to sell the lake house, to stop the transfers, to change the lockbox code, none of that was revenge. I want to be clear about that even now. It was correction. It was me finally doing what I should have done years earlier, which was to stop funding a version of our relationship that had nothing in it for me. Mitchell is a grown man. He made choices, but I made choices too, and mine came first, and they shaped the conditions in which his choices were possible. That is the part I had to sit with. The part that wasn't comfortable. Real honesty never is. What I know now, at 63, is that integrity isn't just about what you refuse to do. It's about what you refuse to keep accepting. There is a kind of slow erosion that happens when you absorb disrespect quietly, year after year, because you love someone and you keep hoping things will turn. The erosion doesn't announce itself. It just wears you down until one message, one phone call, one Thursday evening breaks through and makes visible what was already true. I am glad it happened. I am glad I finally moved. Paige and I still talk. That matters more to me than the lake house ever did. Mitchell and I are finding our way back to something. Slowly, carefully, honestly for the first time in years. That is the only outcome that I actually wanted. A man teaches his children not by the speeches he gives, but by the limits he keeps. I forgot that for a long time. I remembered it when it cost me something. That cost was worth it.